Winter in Montana, 1882. Snow fell thick as a curtain, swallowing the frozen tracks. No train would be coming. At the far end of the platform, Lydia Hayes sat hunched on a bench, clutching a worn cloth bag that had been thinned by time. Her small hands were stiff, nails blue with cold. Each breath rose in a faint white plume, fragile as if it might vanish into the air itself. She was only 18. A black girl, slight and hollowed beneath a threadbare shawl. Days of rattling across the east on hard seats had carried her here with a single hope, that a man would step forward to claim her, to offer her a roof, a place she could call her own. But when the coach door opened, the man only looked her over once from head to toe, lips curling with disdain. Too young, too common. With that, he turned away, leaving Lydia alone in the snow, a stranger in a strange town. On the bench across, a few men had been watching her, their voices slurred with whiskey. That girl's got nowhere to go. She'll freeze dead before morning. One of them laughed low and ugly, the sound steeped in liquor. He staggered to his feet and lurched toward her, boots crunching over the crusted ice. Lydia clutched the bag tighter against her chest, heart pounding, throat locked. "Hey girl, you lost," he breathed, reeking of whiskey. She shook her head, but no words came. Her hands trembled. For a moment, she felt the cold and filth would swallow her whole. "Leave her be." The voice came from behind the drunk, low and steady. The man froze. Lydia lifted her eyes. A broad figure stood there, hat and shoulders dusted in snow. His face was rough-hewn, beard shadowing a jaw weathered by years in the wind. In his arms lay a small child bundled tight in a wool scarf. Malcolm Boone, widower, a man who kept to himself on the outskirts of town. The steel in his gaze drove the drunk back to his seat with a muttered curse. The others fell silent. Only the wind carried through the station, stripping the stench of whiskey from the air. Malcolm stepped closer. Lydia sat motionless, breath unsteady, eyes wide. He said nothing more. He simply stripped off his heavy coat and set it around her shoulders. The weight of it, warm and solid, pressed back the winter wind. "No one should sit in the snow like this," he said, his voice low, rasped like embers in a dying fire. Before she could answer, he shifted the child in his arms and without hesitation set the little girl in Lydia's lap. "Hold her. She's warm." Startled, Lydia stiffened, but the small body leaned into her chest, breath soft and hot against the thin fabric of her dress. She looked down, and the child, Ruth Boone, looked back with clear, unblinking eyes, not crying, not afraid, just watching. And then in a whisper light as snow itself. "Warm." The word was small, but it cracked something inside Lydia's chest. Her lashes fluttered, her hands closed around the child, as if afraid that letting go would steal away the last warmth she might ever know. Malcolm watched them both. For an instant, his eyes softened, though his face held firm. He tugged the coat closer around her shoulders, gave a short nod. "Come on." And in that moment, as snow dusted her tangled curls and Ruth's gaze clung to her face, Lydia Hayes knew her life had turned onto a road she had never imagined. The sleigh ground to a halt on the frozen crust. Lydia lifted her head, breath rising faint and white. Ruth slept against her chest, small arms clinging to the coat's folds. Before them, Boone Ranch came into view. Not a grand estate, just a low log cabin under a roof heavy with snow, a thin thread of smoke drifting steady from the chimney. To Lydia, the sight was nothing less than a promise. There was fire inside, warmth inside, and perhaps a place where she might belong. Malcolm climbed down first, swung open the door. His steps were firm, needing no backward glance, yet Lydia knew she was meant to follow. She carried Ruth in her arms, stumbled across the porch boards after him. When the door opened, heat rushed out and stung her eyes. After so many days on the road, at last she stepped into a house, even if it wasn't hers. The cabin was plain to the point of ache. A rough hewn table pressed against the wall. Lonely chairs set about it. The hearth burned red, but shadows still claimed the corners. On a shelf lay chipped cooking pots, blankets folded sharp but worn thin. No woman's touch, no echo of family, only neatness and a chill that lingered. Lydia paused at the threshold, feeling she had crossed into a domain where a man asked nothing from anyone but himself. Malcolm laid Ruth down on the small bed in the main room, tucking the blanket firm. The child stirred, fat hand clutching at the edge of the quilt as if searching for her mother. Lydia watched, her throat tightening. She didn't know whether to step closer or turn away. "In here," his voice rasped from the hallway. He had opened a narrow door. Lydia followed, finding a cramped space, walls lined with feed sacks, a cot with a threadbare cover. Not fine, but it meant she wouldn't be sleeping in the snow. She nodded. "No thanks spoken." Malcolm answered with a single nod of his own, then shut the door. His boots faded down the hall, leaving her alone. She sat on the cot, pulling the blanket high. Her fingers clutched the coat he had draped around her. The wool held the scent of pine pitch, warm and rough, and her eyes pricked hot. That night, she couldn't sleep. Each time she drifted off, she drew the coat tighter as though afraid it would vanish. Morning brought strange sounds. Lydia cracked the door, stepping softly into the hall. The cabin stood brighter in the pale sun streaming through the window. The kitchen was small, the table bare. On a chair, Ruth sat swinging her legs, hands busy with a slice of bread smeared with red jam. Her little coat hung damp over the backrest, still wet from the snow. Lydia stood watching, then moved without thinking. She found a basin, poured warm water from the kettle, dampened a cloth, and gently wiped the child's sticky hands. Ruth didn't resist, only stared with wide eyes. That gaze gave Lydia pause, yet it drew a faint, hesitant smile to her lips. She turned next to the hearth, gathered the tiny sweaters that hung drying, and folded them one by one. Her hands shook, clumsy in the task. But she pressed each crease with a kind of reverence. To her, those small garments were proof of something she had never known. The shape of a family. The door banged open. Cold swept in. Malcolm entered from the barn, shoulders dusted white, boots thudding on the floorboards. He halted in the doorway. Before him, Ruth with a soft laugh, and Lydia, curls unruly, head bent as she folded the child's clothes with hands thin but careful. His eyes lingered longer than he meant. For a fleeting moment, he saw what he thought forever gone. A house alive, not only with fire, but with presence. He swallowed, set his hat on the table, and came inside. Lydia looked up, and caught his gaze. She startled, lowered her eyes, bent again over the pile. Malcolm turned away, poured coffee, said nothing. Yet something in the room had shifted. When Ruth finished her meal, Lydia cleared the dishes, her hands trembling still, but her eyes steady. Malcolm watched, half ready to stop her, but let it be. He drank in silence, letting her quiet presence stretch across walls that had long been empty. Later, as Lydia returned to her small room, she heard his boots cross the porch again, heading toward the barn. Ruth stayed behind, drawing circles with a finger on the table, eyes flicking now and then toward Lydia. She spoke no word, but in that look, Lydia felt the edge of belonging. No full claim, not yet family, but not wholly an outsider either. She shut her door and leaned against it, unease stirring. Was this only a shelter? A pause in the road? Or could it be something that endured? Her hand found the coat once more. The warmth from last night still clung there. For the first time in many days, a fragile spark lit in her chest. Perhaps she would not have to wander anymore. That morning, Lydia rose earlier than usual. The fire still glowed faintly from the night before, wood popping in the quiet kitchen. Ruth had just woken, hair tangled, eyes half shut, clutching her worn, stuffed bear. Lydia knelt before her, touched her shoulder gently. "Would you like a warm bath?" Ruth froze. Since her mother's passing, no one had bathed her but Malcolm, and he did it rough, pouring cold water quickly. The child hesitated, fingers gripping her bear tight. Lydia smiled, soft and steady, like a warm spring, not cold. She boiled water, poured it into a small wooden tub. Steam rose, blurring the air. Ruth peeked at her, then gave a tiny nod. Lydia pulled up a chair, carefully undressed her. Ink stains marked her hands. Dirt clung to her legs. And Lydia's chest tightened at the sight. At first, the child shrank, but when Lydia scooped warm water, trickling it through her hair with a whisper, "It's like summer rain," Ruth suddenly burst into giggles. The sound filled the cabin. A house long used to silence. Ruth laughed high and bright, echoing off the walls. Lydia froze, startled, then smiled herself, hands gentle as she washed the girl's hair. Outside, Malcolm split wood, the axe bit sharp, logs cracking apart, sweat on his brow despite the cold. He stiffened when the laughter reached him through the door. How long had it been since he'd heard that sound? His shoulders sagged, his grip on the handle loosened, and his blows slowed. A heart he thought sealed forever stirred at the pure, remembered sound of his daughter's joy. That evening, Lydia tried her hand at supper. She wanted to prove herself useful, not a burden. She searched the pantry. A strip of dried meat, an onion, a few potatoes. Vaguely recalling a recipe her mother once made, she lit the fire and dropped the meat into the pot, but the flame was too strong, and she forgot the water. When Malcolm stepped in, smoke rolled thick, meat blackened in the iron pot, his voice cut cold. "You trying to burn this place down?" Lydia flinched, eyes wide. The words hit like a blade. I only wanted to cook for you both. If you don't know, don't guess." The words struck like ice. She dropped the spoon, fled into the snow, tears spilling as she stumbled across the yard and into the barn. The air stank of hay and horse sweat, but at least no eyes followed her there. She sank to the straw, hugging her knees, sobbing. Every effort to carve a place here had turned to ashes. After a time, the barn door creaked open. Ruth appeared, clutching her bear tied to her chest. She crept forward, small feet rustling the hay. Lydia looked up, wiping her face. Ruth said nothing at first, only pulled a broken cookie from her pocket and pressed it into Lydia's hand. "Don't go." The words were whispered, eyes locked to hers, innocent but resolute. Then the child wrapped her arms around Lydia's neck, the smell of her hair clean and sweet. Lydia trembled, holding her back, tears falling again, this time because she was wanted. Ruth returned to the cabin, cheeks flushed, and faced her father. "Papa, you say sorry. You made her cry." Malcolm halted, staring down. He wasn't used to being challenged, least of all by a child of 5, but the look in her eyes robbed him of any defense. For the first time, he realized not only Lydia had been wounded, his daughter had felt it, too. That night, Lydia stayed in the barn, exhaustion pulling her into sleep on the straw. Malcolm came later, meaning to offer some clumsy apology. But what he found stopped him still, the frail girl curled in the hay, clutching the broken cookie in her hand, tear-streaked face now calm under the shaft of moonlight. Without a word, he bent down and lifted her. She stirred, startled awake, cheeks burning at finding herself in his arms. "Put me down. I can walk." Her voice trembled, but Malcolm didn't slow. His stride was firm across the snow, straight back into the cabin. Lydia pressed her face into his chest, heart racing. He laid her on the small bed, drew the blanket over her. For a long moment, he stood, eyes resting on her tear-stained face. "I spoke too harsh. I'm sorry." Lydia stared, caught off guard, then turned her face aside, pulse quick and loud in her ears. Silence filled the room, broken only by the awkward rhythm of their breathing. Malcolm gave a slight nod and turned away. As the door closed behind him, Lydia's eyes followed the broad shoulders swallowed in shadow. She clutched the blanket tighter, cheeks flushed, embarrassed. Yet deep within, something had shifted. The first day, Lydia rode with Malcolm into town. The sun was sharp, though snow still lined the roadside. They sat in the sleigh, Ruth wedged between, her small hands gripping her father's coat. Lydia leaned slightly aside, fingers holding the frayed hem of her old dress. She tried to sit straight, eyes lowered, heart hammering as the line of wooden buildings rose ahead. Hooves struck the frozen ground like drum beats, announcing their arrival into the world of watching eyes. Just as she feared, Saddle Creek met her with a chill colder than any winter wind. The blacksmiths out front stopped talking, eyes following each turn of the sleigh. At the general store, women weighing sugar paused, their gazes fixed on the black girl riding beside Malcolm Boone. A dry laugh rang behind her, followed by a voice pitched to reach her ears. "Mail order misfit." Another voice chimed in, mocking. "Used goods, most likely." Heat rushed to Lydia's cheeks. Not shame, but a muted ache. She bit back tears, bowing her head. In front of the bakery, a woman held her young son's hand. When Lydia passed, the boy lifted his palm in greeting. His mother yanked him back, eyes sharp as if warding off some contagion. Lydia bit her lip until it bled. She said nothing. Malcolm's face hardened beside her, hands clenched on the residential until his knuckles whitened. He spoke no word, did not look her way, only urged the horse faster. When they cleared the town, Lydia lifted her head, drew a long breath. The sting still clung to her chest, but she forced the tears down. She had grown too used to being looked down upon to grant her tormentors the victory of seeing her weep. In the days that followed, she rarely left the ranch. Instead, she worked, washing clothes, mending table linens, scrubbing dishes. Slowly, her touch left its mark everywhere. Kitchen tidy. Ruth's blankets unsewed. A cloth spread across the table. The ranch became more than wood walls and shadows. It breathed now with the presence of a woman. Malcolm gave no praise. But one evening, as Lydia cleared the table, he set before her a bowl of hot soup. No words, no lingering glance. Yet it was enough to make her sit still, hand tightening around the spoon. Ruth noticed first. One afternoon she scribbled with charcoal on a scrap of paper, then ran to the table proud. The drawing was simple. 3 figures, one tall, one small-haired, and a little girl between, linked together by a lopsided red heart. She pointed them out in turn. "Me, Papa. Mama." Lydia froze, her chest caught. Malcolm frowned, staring at the sketch, lips pressed thin. He said nothing, only slid the paper aside. Ruth pouted. Lydia bent her head, hiding the faintest smile. Deep inside, a small light flickered, weak, but enough to guide a weary heart. That night, when Lydia returned to her narrow room, she found a pair of shoes set neatly at the bed's foot. Not new, but cleaned. Laces replaced, solace patched with thick cloth, clipped to the toe was a scrap of paper. The words scrolled plain but firm. "A sturdy pair of shoes will carry you to where you belong." She sat down, lifted them into her hands. Tears rose, unstoppable this time. Pressing the note to her chest, she whispered as though making a vow. "Perhaps at last I found the road." Out in the hall, Malcolm stood silent in the dark, his hands still carrying the smell of polish. He did not knock, did not speak. He only turned away, heart unsettled. He was not used to opening, not used to trusting. Yet in his daughter's eyes and in the young woman's presence, he began to see what he had long believed gone, a home. Late in the day, Malcolm took Lydia and Ruth into town for a few supplies. The main road lay under a thin sheet of ice, the sleigh runners screeching beneath the early moon. Outside the feed store, a man stumbled out. Face flushed with drink. Laughter cutting through the cold. "Malcolm Boone," he bellowed, slapping Malcolm's shoulder, his eyes sliding to Lydia, standing silent. "So, when's the wedding, Boone? Going to turn that girl into a nanny for hire?" The roar of laughter from his friends struck like a blade. Lydia froze, every word carving itself into her chest. Her face burned hot while the rest of her body chilled. She lowered her head, clutching her small bag close, pretending not to hear. Malcolm gave no reply, only pulled Ruth nearer, and walked on. but his silence pierced Lydia sharper than the mockery. That night, after the cabin had gone dark, Lydia sat alone in her small room. She laid out her thin bag on the bed, folded her few belongings inside, a worn dress, a handkerchief, the shoes Malcolm had given her. Her trembling fingers brushed the scrap of paper she still kept tucked away. The ranch had given her warmth, but the stairs in town and Malcolm's silence reminded her she was still an outsider. Tears slid soundless. She tied the bag, pulled on her cloak, and slipped into the night. The wind howled, snow slashing her face. Lydia tightened the scarf at her throat and pressed forward through the storm. Each step sank deep, as if the weight in her chest pressed her down. Behind her came hoofbeats, fast and urgent. Malcolm had discovered her absence. He urged his horse hard into the storm. "Lydia," he called, voice ragged against the wind. She turned, tears blurring her sight. Through the swirling dark, his horse struck ice. He hauled at the reins, but too late. The animal slipped and Malcolm crashed to the ground, a cry torn from him. Lydia ran to him, heart racing. Are you hurt?" His teeth clenched, hand clutching his thigh, pain keeping him from standing. Lydia dropped her bag, knelt beside him, panic rising. The storm whipped her face raw, but all she saw was the man shuddering in pain. Without thought, she slid an arm beneath his shoulder, straining to lift. He outweighed her twice over, his heavy frame dragging her down. Yet she set her jaw, forcing each step forward, dragging him through the storm toward the cabin. Every stumble, every muffled groan, every time his hand clenched her thin arm, through it all, their eyes met in the white fury, locked for what felt an endless span. When the cabin door closed behind them, firelight wrapped them both again. Lydia eased Malcolm onto the long bench, hurried to feed the flames. Her hands shook, but held steady as she tugged off his frozen boots and cleaned the wound at his thigh. Malcolm sat silent, his gaze fixed on the bent figure before him, hair damp with snow, face pale but determined. At last his voice broke through, rough with strain. "You brought laughter back to this house." Lydia's head snapped up. His eyes met hers unflinching. In the cold moonlight spilling through the window, she saw something there she had never glimpsed before. Something raw, urgent, unhidden. Her heart stuttered, hand gripping the edge of her scarf. She could not find words, only gave a small nod, lowering her head. But in that nod lay an answer. In the days that followed, Malcolm could not yet walk without help. Lydia stayed close, steadying him step by step, from bed to hearth, from porch to barn. At first, her hand barely brushed his arm, but slowly her grip grew firmer, his weight leaning heavier. Once, when he faltered too far, she caught him and his whole frame fell against her. In that instant, their eyes locked. Close enough, she felt the rush of his breath. Close enough, he saw the flush rise across her cheeks. They pulled apart quickly, embarrassed into silence. Yet from then on, every touch lingered longer. Every glance held something more. Fragile but warm. Ruth saw it before they did. She skipped around them one morning, clapping her hands. "Papa's walking now, thanks to Mama." Malcolm started to correct her, but when his eyes met Lydia's, he only stayed quiet. For the first time, silence did not cut. It brimmed with acknowledgement. One evening, Lydia sat by the fire with a needle and thread. Malcolm rested in the long chair, his legs still bound. He watched her, flame light flickering in his eyes. She looked up, caught his gaze, and her heart faltered. They both turned away at once, shy, awkward. But within that awkwardness, something had shifted, steady as stone. Outside, the wind still raged across the land. Inside, Boone Ranch was no longer cold. It held sighs, the clink of spoons, the uneven thud of steps, and the faint trembling rhythm of hearts. Lydia no longer wished to leave. Days passed, and the wound in Malcolm's thigh eased. He could walk now, slow and stiff, without Lydia at his side. Yet the habit had formed. Each night, once Ruth had drifted to sleep, Lydia prepared warm water, clean cloth, and knelt beside him to change the bandage. Her hands, once awkward, had grown sure, so gentle that at times Malcolm forgot the pain altogether. That evening the cabin lay quieter than most. The wind screamed outside, but within only firelight burned against the log walls, the wood snapping softly in the hearth. Malcolm sat on the long chair, trousers pulled above the knee, while Lydia bent before him, slender hands pressing fresh linen to the wound. Her curls tumbled forward, brushing against his knee. Malcolm watched, his heart faltering in its rhythm. When she reached to tie the cloth, his hand closed over hers, firm, but not rough. Lydia's head jerked up, wide eyes catching the fire's reflection. Malcolm leaned closer, voice low, drawn deep from his chest. "I will never bring you pain." Her hands trembled. 5 plain words, yet they shattered the walls she had built around her heart. No one had ever said such a thing. No one had ever counted her safety as something sacred. Tears welled and fell, burning against her cheeks in the cold night. She would have turned away, but Malcolm's hand held steady, his eyes fixed on hers. Silence pressed heavy, broken only by the hammer of her pulse. She swallowed, gave a small nod, a quiet answer. Malcolm released her hand, but the distance between them had already changed forever. Just then, light footsteps padded from the bedroom. Ruth shuffled out, clutching her threadbare bear, eyes heavy with sleep. She blinked at them, then walked forward and held the toy out to Lydia. "It's Mama's now." Lydia froze, tears still wet on her face. Her hands shook as she accepted the ragged toy, its fabric worn with years. To Ruth, it was the most precious thing she had. The one she had never parted with since her mother's passing. Lydia's throat closed. She pulled the child into her arms, the bear pressed between them. Malcolm stood watching, silent, yet his gaze softened. He had just witnessed a rite needing no words. Ruth had given Lydia her place in this house. Night sank deeper. Ruth slept again, arms wrapped around a quilt in place of the bear. In the main room, the fire still glowed, casting long shadows across 2 figures. Lydia sat on the bench, the bear in her lap, eyes swollen from tears. Malcolm sat across from her, quiet. The air hung heavy, not with distance, but with something waiting to break open. He rose, each step deliberate, until he stood before her. Lydia clutched the bear, heart pounding. He sat beside her, so near she felt the warmth of his breath. His hand brushed lightly over the back of hers, tentative, as if afraid to shatter something fragile. "Lydia." She looked up, their eyes met. No defenses, no evasion, only 2 souls long burdened with loneliness, finding a place to rest. Malcolm raised his hand, thumb brushing the damp from her cheek. Lydia's lashes fluttered, but she did not turn away. The moment drew them together. Their first kiss was slow, hesitant, as though rushing might break the spell. Breath mingled. Wood smoke and fire clung around them. No blaze of passion, no fevered claim. Only 2 people once left behind, now choosing each other. Malcolm folded her into his chest, arms solid yet tender. Lydia leaned in fully, letting tears flow free. For the first time, she wept not from pain, but because she was loved as a woman, wholly and truly. That night, they belonged to one another in the glow of the fire, not hurried, not desperate, but in a simple declaration. Lydia was no longer cast aside, no longer the bride abandoned. She was seen. She was chosen. She was kept. And when sleep finally claimed her in Malcolm's arms, the old bear slipped to the floor. In the flicker of flame, their shadows formed 3 together. For the first time, a family whole. That afternoon, the sky pressed heavy, gray enough to bury the valley whole. Wind screamed through the canyon, carrying a cold sharp as a blade. Malcolm nailed boards over the window frames, stacked wood by the hearth, bracing for the storm rolling down on them. Ruth played on the rug, the old bear tucked in her arms, cheeks flushed brighter than usual. Lydia noticed first. When she bent close, her hand to the child's forehead, the heat nearly made her gasp. Malcolm, Ruth's burning. He spun around. One touch was enough. The fever burned through her daughter's small frame. His usual calm vanished. He strode the room like a caged animal, fists clenching, eyes wide with panic. I have to reach Dr. Rigsby. You can't. Lydia cut him off. Look at that wind. The road's already gone. You wouldn't get across the ice river alive. Malcolm froze. He had faced wolves, braved winters that near broke him, but never had he felt as helpless as now. His lips moved, words failing as he stared at his daughter, gasping in Lydia's arms. Then what do we do? Lydia clutched Ruth tighter, dragged more blankets close, stoked the fire high. Her voice trembled but held steady. I'll stay here with her. We keep her warm, wipe her sweat, give her water, a sip at a time, and pray. Pray the fever breaks. Night came heavy. The blizzard howled, slamming fists of snow against the walls. Inside, the fire roared, but no heat could drive away the fear that filled the room. Lydia sat in the rocker. Ruth rapped against her chest. She pressed warm cloths to the girl's brow, wrung them out, laid them again, tireless. At times Ruth whimpered, lashes trembling. Lydia bent close, whispering old lullabies her mother once sang. Words she had never shared with another. For the first time in her life, she prayed not for herself, not for deliverance. Every breath, every tear, every plea was poured into the fragile life blazing in her arms. Malcolm stood at the kitchen's edge, staring. He paced like a beast cornered, calloused hands twisted until the skin split. Sometimes he left to fetch more wood, to swing the axe, if only to escape the sight of his own helplessness. Yet each time he returned, Lydia was still there, hair tangled, eyes hollow with weariness, but hands steady, voice quivering yet unbroken. Near midnight, the fever climbed higher. Ruth shivered in delirium, sweat pouring, breath ragged. Lydia was near collapse, eyes raw, hands shaking too much to wring another cloth. Malcolm stepped forward, ready to take her place. But Lydia shook her head, clutching the child. Let me. She needs me. 4 words, nothing more. But they stopped him cold. She needs me. No one had spoken such words of Ruth since the day her mother died. He sat down opposite, watching long and hard, as if for the first time, believing that Lydia had not entered this house out of pity, but out of love. Outside the storm shrieked, the valley drowned in white. But in the cabin, only the fire's glow remained, and the whispered prayers of a woman begging life for a child not her own. Toward dawn, the fever broke. Ruth stirred, eyes fluttering open, weary but clear. Lydia choked, clutching her close, tears falling onto the child's damp brow. The girl blinked, lips parting in a faint breath. Mama. The word was small, fragile as the wind through the eaves, yet it pierced straight through Lydia's chest. She shook, holding the child so tight she could scarcely breathe. Malcolm stood frozen in the doorway, hand gripping the frame until his knuckles blanched, his breath caught, eyes locked on the sight before him. Mama. That word swept aside every doubt, every barrier. He saw plain Ruth had chosen. And Lydia had become part of this family. By the time morning light bled through the mountains, snow still lay thick, but the storm had quieted. Inside the cabin, Ruth slept peacefully in Lydia's arms, breath steady. Lydia sat hollowed, a weary smile flickering on her lips. Malcolm stepped forward and sat beside her. He said nothing, only set his broad hand gently on her shoulder. The touch was firm, wordless, like a vow. For the first time, his eyes on her held no reserve, no suspicion, only trust and gratitude. In the pale dawn light, Lydia felt the truth settle deep. The old wounds were still there, but a new family had taken root right in the heart of the harshest winter. Spring stretched across the prairie. Snow thawed, strips of green pushing up from soggy earth. Horses ran, manes streaming in the new sun, their breath white in the clear air. Lydia stood at the wooden fence, watching, her face bright in the morning light. She was no longer the thin girl who had trembled at the station. She was a woman who could lean on herself. Ruth darted about at her mother's feet, skirt flying, clutching a wild flower she had just picked. The child's laugh rang through the yard and made Malcolm pause as he came from the barn, shoulders dropping a fraction. The house that had once been all silence now brimmed with sound. Then the past Lydia had thought left at the depot found them. One afternoon, as Malcolm led a horse home, a figure appeared at the ranch gate. He sat straight in a long coat, squinting under a wide-brimmed hat. Lydia went still at once. It was the man who had left her on the platform, the same man who had sneered, "Too young, too common," and turned away. He dismounted and walked up, a smug smile on his face. "I looked everywhere. Now I know where you've been hiding." Lydia stepped back, her chest weighty. "What do you want here?" "To take you back," he said blunt. "I thought it over. Maybe you're not so bad. Marry me and you'll have a roof, food, clothes. If not, you'll go back to servant work. You owe me. You don't get to choose." The words fell like a chain meant to bind her again. Lydia trembled, then flared with fury. "I don't owe you anything. You left me like damaged goods. I won't go back." The man hesitated, then spat. "You think Boone will keep you forever? You're a burden. He'll toss you out soon enough." A dry click of metal answered. Malcolm stepped forward from the porch. His shotgun steady in his hands. His eyes were steel. His voice was low and heavy. "She belongs to me. No man has any right to touch her, least of all scum like you." The man's color drained when he saw the black barrel. He backed off, snarling, spat on the ground, and managed a forced laugh. "You'll regret this day." He vaulted back into the saddle, cracked his whip, and rode hard across the fields, leaving dust behind. Lydia collapsed to the step, hands over her face, tears breaking free like a long-stopped river. All the shame, fear, and the memory of being abandoned rushed back at once. Ruth heard and ran out, arms small and fierce around Lydia's neck. "Mama, don't cry. I'm here." Lydia clutched the child and sobbed. Malcolm dropped to his knees beside them and wrapped both in his broad arms. His voice came low and sure, a wall against the wind. "It's all right. I'm here. No one's taking you away." Lydia buried her face in his chest, Ruth between them, and they held each other under the long dusk. In that moment, Lydia knew the past might come. But she was no longer alone. Malcolm guarded her not only with a gun, but with a heart that had opened after Sion, years that felt like stone. Night fell and the hearth flamed in the cabin. Lydia mended the skirt's torn hem while Ruth slept across her lap. Malcolm sat opposite, watching without a word. The small squeeze he gave her hand as he passed the cup said it all. "You belong here." In that quiet, Lydia heard her own heart. No more shrinking, no more doubt, only a quiet faith that this time she had truly been chosen and would never be left again. May lay golden light across the prairie. Fresh grass stretched far and wide. Barley swayed like waves under the wind. Horses ran full tilt, dust rising bright as mist in the morning sun. Boone Ranch no longer bore the somber air it had when Lydia first set foot there. Now it pulsed with Ruth's laughter, the smell of fresh bread, and the steady presence of a black woman moving through every room. The gossip about Lydia had once spread through Saddle Creek. Mail order misfit cast off. But time turned whispers into something else. One morning, Mrs. Whitaker, the blacksmith's wife, came to the ranch, coughing deep, hand pressed to her chest. Lydia remembered the remedies her mother had taught her. Brew ginger tea with honey and a sprig of dried mint. The woman's cough eased. The next day she returned, bringing warm bread and a few potatoes in thanks. After that, others began to come. A child with a cold, an old man with aching joints, a young girl hoping to learn enough letters to write her brother at war. Lydia listened, patient, offering whatever she knew slowly. The stares of contempt in town shifted. Heads began to nod. Soft greetings replaced silence. One Sunday afternoon, Malcolm took Lydia and Ruth to the small church at the center of Saddle Creek. The wooden doors opened, candle smoke hanging inside. Lydia tightened her grip on Ruth's hand as she entered, memory sharp and bitter. Days when townsfolk had pulled their children away from her as if she were a stain. But this time, no one did. A few women glanced back, then nodded. Mrs. Whitaker smiled, made room on the pew. Lydia sat down, heart racing, hardly able to believe what she saw. When service ended, Ruth bounded out into the yard. She seized Lydia's hand, then called out clear across the crowd, "Mama, lift me up." The air went still. People turned. Lydia froze, face burning, bracing for the familiar wave of laughter and scorn. It never came. Instead, the pastor chuckled softly. "Sweet little thing." Others nodded, even smiled. Lydia lifted her eyes in wonder. And when she looked to Malcolm, he did not correct Ruth. Did not flinch. He simply set his rough hand on Lydia's back, steady, calm. In that moment, her chest swelled. For the first time, she no longer felt the weight of being an outsider. In the weeks that followed, Lydia wove herself deeper into the life of the town. She brought cakes to the market fair, handed them to children racing by. She taught a few girls to sign their names, to read scraps of scripture. When the first summer storm swept through, she welcomed neighbors beneath the boon porch, poured them hot tea. Malcolm said little, but he saw it all. Eyes that once slid away now softened. Lips that once whispered now greeted her plain. And every time Ruth skipped at her side, shouting, "Mama," as if to stake a claim before the world. One evening, Lydia sat under the oil lamp, sewing a dress for Ruth. Malcolm came in from the fields, dust and sweat clinging to his shirt. He paused in the doorway, watching. Ruth lay across Lydia's lap, breathing deep in sleep, lips still murmuring, "Mama." Lydia looked up, caught his gaze. No words passed between them. Silence was enough. They had traveled farther than either had once dared believe. That night, she stepped onto the porch. The prairie lay bathed in moonlight, wind cool across her face. She set her hand on the railing, filled with a feeling she had never known. Acceptance, not only from one man, but from a town that had once turned away. Malcolm joined her without gun or heavy coat. He stood close, gel, shoulders brushing hers. He didn't look at her when he spoke. "They see you now for who you are." Lydia smiled, eyes bright with tears. "And you never denied me." Malcolm turned, his large hand folding over hers. Moonlight washed them both, bearing witness to a vow unspoken. They had become a true family before their own hearts and before the town's watching eyes. Mornings at Boone Ranch no longer carried the hard silence of grief. As the sun broke over the ridges, Ruth's laughter rang across the yard. She ran in circles, linen dress flying, humming half-tuned songs Lydia had taught her. The childish voice mixing with the crow of roosters and the thud of laundry on the washboard turned a house once smothered by mourning into a true home. In the kitchen, Lydia knelt by the wooden tub, hands steady as she scrubbed clothes. The water was biting cold, yet her heart warmed strangely with each stroke. Every time she lifted her head, she caught the wide-eyed gaze of the little girl watching her. Ruth giggled when splashed, the sound so bright, Lydia knew she was not just surviving here. She was needed. From the barn, Malcolm returned, boots soaked with morning dew. He stopped at the doorway, arms folded, and watched the scene inside. Lydia with a kerchief tied over her hair, Ruth dancing beside her. He had seen it every morning of late, yet it struck him each time. A piece he thought widowhood had buried forever. He stepped in, set the saddle down, came closer. Without a word, he placed his rough hand lightly against Lydia's back. The touch was fleeting, yet enough to make her glance up, cheeks burning. Malcolm lowered his gaze, voice rough and low. "I came back." It was no grand promise, only a whisper. But for Lydia, such touches were worth more than gold. They said simply that he wanted to return to her day after day. At noon, they gathered at the wooden table. Lydia ladled soup. Ruth chattered about catching a butterfly in the yard. Malcolm listened, mouth hinting a smile. Once he reached over, dropped another piece of potato into Lydia's bowl, then leaned back as though nothing had happened. Small gestures. Yet to Lydia they carried weight. Proof that she had a place at his table and in his heart on the floor. Ruth sprawled with a scrap of charcoal, sketching 3 figures beneath a roof with a red heart drawn over all. She waved it proudly. "This is our family." Malcolm did not correct her. He did not frown. He only laid a hand on the child's head, eyes lifting briefly to Lydia, silent in his acceptance. By dusk, Lydia sat on the porch steps, mending clothes while the prairie glowed in sunset. Ruth rested against her lap, eyes drifting close to the sound of Lydia's soft lullaby. Songs once buried in memory rose again, not for her own comfort, but as a sign she belonged here. Malcolm walked in from the fields, shoulders dusted, face darkened by sun. He halted for a moment, staring at the picture before him. 2 shadows cast long across the boards, fused into the orange of evening. Something deep stirred in him, tender and unspoken. He stepped closer, hand settling gently on her shoulder. She glanced up, caught his eyes, then bent quickly over her sewing to hide her smile. Words were unnecessary. The silence in this house had become their language. That night, Ruth slept soundly in her small bed. Lydia banked the fire, drew the blanket higher, and turned. Malcolm sat at the table, still turning a small knife he had been sharpening. When she passed, he held out a wooden box, plain and unpolished. "For you." Inside lay a simple comb carved by hand, rough but careful. Lydia froze, fingers trembling as she touched it. "Why? Why would you make this?" Malcolm shrugged, eyes lowered. "Saw you using your hands to smooth your hair. Thought this might be easier." Her eyes filled. No one had ever noticed such a small thing about her. She pressed the comb to her chest, whispering, voice breaking. "Thank you." Malcolm rose, came near, set his broad hand against her cheek. Lydia looked up, heart racing, eyes locked with his in the lamplight. No kiss was needed, no oath spoken. That moment alone said enough. They belonged to each other. Days followed, filled with sounds Malcolm once believed he'd never hear again. Ruth sounding out her letters. Lydia calling across the yard when the wind rose. Laughter mingling with the whinny of horses. For Lydia, every touch on her back, every fleeting glance, every rough murmur of "I came back" became a treasure. She needed no loud declaration, no wedding ceremony. A family had already taken root here in the warmth of the fire. In the rhythm of laundry, in the quiet weight of his hand on her shoulder, and in the clear voice of Ruth calling her mama, Lydia knew at last she was no longer lost. She had found her home, and a love as steady as the Montana earth itself. That afternoon, Montana wore a coat of gold. The setting sun spread its light across the prairie, turning young grass into a sea of fire. Boone Ranch stood quiet in the glow, the porch casting long shadows on the boards. Lydia had just finished the wash, hanging each piece on the line, listening to the wind carry the warm scent of grass. Malcolm stood by the fence, eyes fixed on the field. He had come back from the barn, clothes still smelling of dry hay, but his mind was restless. For days he had carried thoughts he had never spoken. Each night he watched Lydia by the fire. Ruth curled against her and his chest grew heavy as though words long unsaid pressed against his ribs. He walked toward the porch, boots striking steady on the wood. Lydia looked up, startled at the fire in his eyes. Malcolm did not circle around his meaning. His voice came deep, edged with both tremor and resolve. "You made my heart beat again." The garment slipped from Lydia's hands. Those words burned through her, undoing the quiet belief that she was only his cook, his child's caretaker, his companion. Through empty days, now the world beneath her feet tilted. Malcolm stepped closer. No ring, no wooden box, no polished speech. Only his calloused hands held out before her. "I have nothing but this land, these hands, and a heart I thought long dried. But if you'll have me, all I need is your word." Lydia's throat tightened, tears welling and breaking free. She placed her trembling hand in his. I waited for someone to choose me, not out of need, but out of want. And now I have been chosen. The words broke into sobs. She buried her face against his chest, shoulders shaking. Malcolm wrapped her tight, arms like ramparts around the woman once scorned, now the center of his life. The last of the sunlight poured over them. Two shadows bound together on the worn boards. For the first time, Malcolm was no longer alone, and Lydia was no longer the girl abandoned at the station. Two souls, once wandering, had found each other. Suddenly, Ruth darted out of the doorway, clutching her ragged bear. She shouted with glee, "Papa! Mama," then threw herself into their embrace. She vanished between Malcolm's broad arms and Lydia's tender hold. Her innocent smile a blessing spoken without words. Malcolm bent low, holding them both. His voice, rough with feeling, rumbled near Lydia's ear. "From this day, we are a family. No papers, no wedding bands, only a vow not to leave." Lydia lifted her tear-streaked face, smiling through the ache of her throat, the golden light glinting off her tears. That night, when Ruth had gone to sleep, Lydia stepped out to the porch beneath the thin new moon. Malcolm leaned against a post, staring at the dark fields. She came beside him, wordless, laying her hand over his gnarled fingers laced firmly with hers. No more words were needed. The porch, the hearth, the fields, all had become theirs. She rested her head on his shoulder, listening to her heart strike steady, no longer faltering. For the first time, she felt not just allowed to stay, but openly claimed. Nothing, no one could take that moment from her. In Montana's quiet night, a family was truly made whole. Summer laid its green mantle over Boone Ranch. The prairie rolled like waves, wildflowers lifting their heads along the fence. Lydia set a vase of purple and yellow blossoms on the porch, her hands moving quick as she hummed under her breath. Ruth ran barefoot through the yard, clutching her ragged bear, her laughter carrying far on the wind. Every day the sounds wove together, the thud of the wash paddle, the smell of bread in the oven, Ruth's halting lessons with her letters. The ranch, once filled only with wind and lonely footsteps, now sang like a household alive. Travelers passing by often paused, tilted their heads, and smiled. No more cold stares. No more cruel words. Malcolm watched from the porch as Lydia bent to straighten the flower bed. He stepped forward, placed his rough palm against her back, and whispered low like the wind brushing her ear. "You're the reason this place is called home." Lydia turned, her eyes glistening. She didn't answer in words, only with a quiet smile. Deep inside, she knew. The station had once been a place of frost and fear, but Boone Ranch had given back warmth enough to cover it all. That afternoon, Ruth crouched on the wooden floor with a stick of chalk. She drew 3 figures, tall, small, and a little girl in between, all joined by a bright red heart. Lydia gathered her close. Malcolm came to look, nodded once, and said nothing, but pride was plain in his gaze. In the kitchen, Lydia folded blankets, mended clothes, and let her humming seep into every corner. Malcolm grew used to the thought of someone waiting when he came back. Each morning before leaving for the fields, he set his callous hand lightly, firmly on her back. "I'll be back." Few words. Yet Lydia kept them like treasure. She needed no flowers, no promises spun with gold. Knowing he chose to return each day was enough. One evening, when the work was done, they sat on the porch together. Montana's breeze was cool. The sky crowded with stars spilling light like grains of salt. Ruth curled in Lydia's lap, yawning, bare tucked against her chest. Malcolm draped a wool blanket over mother and child, then settled beside them. No talk was needed, only the chirp of insects, the sweep of wind over grass, and the steady pulse of quiet hearts. Lydia leaned her head on his shoulder, her hair brushing his shirt. Ruth stirred, murmuring in her sleep, "Papa, Mama." Malcolm smiled and drew them both into his chest. Lydia closed her eyes and the tears slipped free, not from sorrow, but from joy. That night they knew family did not require ceremony, nor rings, nor signatures on paper. What they held was greater, the daily choosing. Malcolm chose to set aside his loneliness and open his chest again. Lydia chose to remain, not to flee. Ruth chose to trust, to give a stranger the most sacred name, Mama, and they would go on choosing day after day. When the wind stilled, a shooting star scored the Montana sky. Malcolm squeezed Lydia's hand and whispered, "We're home." She nodded, her eyes shining bright as the heavens themselves. Boone Ranch, once a place of shadow, now stood as a true home, where old wounds had softened into peace, where three broken hearts found each other and fitted together as one family. They stayed on the porch until Ruth drifted deep into dreams. The fire in the hearth had burned low. Yet warmth no longer depended on wood. It burned inside their chests. Perhaps after all the storms, what remains is not the scar nor the loss, but the home one chooses. Lydia had once been abandoned at a frozen station. Malcolm had once lived in solitude like ashes. Ruth had once carried silence where her mother's voice should have been. Yet here they were, bound by no ring, no proclamation, only by gestures small, glances soft, and a whispered vow. "I'll be back." That is what makes a house a home. Not timber nor stone, but the love people choose to lay upon one another each day. Boone Ranch, once bleak and empty, had become a hearth. Where a child's laughter rang, where a woman once rejected, now stood at the center of affection, and where a man once hardened by grief had found the courage to open his heart again. And perhaps you who have lived through many seasons see yourself in this tale. Perhaps you have known what it is to be left behind, to be scorned, to believe there would be no second chance. Or perhaps you've learned a truth plain as day. Happiness is never late. It comes in a hand pressed lightly to your back, in a sudden mama, in a grip that holds tight beneath a sky full of stars. If this story has touched you, share with us which moment stirred you most. Was it when Lydia was wrapped in a coat against the winter night? When Ruth's laughter broke loose in the washtub, or when Malcolm offered his scarred hands in place of a ring? We would be honored to hear your truth, for it is your voices that keep the fire of these Wild West love stories burning bright. Don't forget to press like if warmth reached your heart and subscribe to join us on the trail ahead. Leave a comment. Tell us of a memory, a person, or a moment when you knew this is home. For in the end, love is not the grand gesture. It is the daily choosing. And I believe every heart, though once broken, can still find its true